Hey everyone, this is Dave. Hope you've been doing okay on these last couple of red days we've been having. Today, we're going to be going over the primer video for Rocket Lab's Q4 earnings call, what I'm expecting, what I'm thinking about, what to look out for, that kind of thing. Before we get into that, though, I do just want to thank some new channel members. I know a bunch of you probably got these subs gifted by me during a recent live stream, but it all still counts. So welcome to the squad. We have David Hudson, On Orbit Studio, Batarang 67, Cameron Davis, and Blazer Jeremy. Thank you guys for the support and watching as always. And if you're not a member, always just appreciate a subscription because that really does help out with the growth of the channel. Okay, with that out of the way, let's dive into Rocket Lab's Q4 earnings primer. So starting off with Neutron, eyes on the prize is kind of the theme that I have for this earnings call. Yes, we're going to go over numbers. Yes, that is important, whether they beat revenue estimates and guidance, whether they miss margins, all that stuff. However, with a growing company like Rocket Lab that is investing so heavily into a big new project that's not yet delivering any revenue to the bottom line, by far the biggest factor is the progress of Neutron, whether things are going well, what language the company is starting to use around Neutron's launch date. We know that they had guided for middle of this year, and that's coming up pretty quick now. So if they start saying things like, well, it's a green light schedule, it's still possible to hit middle of the year, that should be a sign, I think, to all of us that we're probably looking at a little bit later in the year and there may be a delay. Remember, the company will kind of reaffirm that launch timeline up until the second that they announce a delay. So you could have literally one day saying, yes, the timeline is still in play, to the next day, oh, we're delaying it by 6 months. I know that's what happened the last time around, and that's just kind of how these things work. Until they officially announce that they can no longer hit a timeline, they will continue reiterating it. But sometimes we do get a sense based on the language they use, how confident they are feeling in those timelines. So what we want to see with Neutron is the management feeling quite confident. We want to see some good pictures of Neutron's progress and hopefully the overall structure coming together. More on that in a little bit. If you saw my video on the recent payload guide for Neutron, we did get a bit of a surprise, which was that they are dividing the rocket into this core module versus the upper module. I'd love to hear a little bit from Peter on the thought process behind this design, what advantages it gives them, why it is a better way to go. Obviously gives them additional flexibility, and really just want to hear Peter's thoughts on the current progress of Neutron, because every month, every day that goes by where Neutron isn't ready to launch, they're burning capital. We've basically heard looking at like $40 million per quarter. So if there's, a quarter delay on Neutron, that's like an extra $40 million burned basically for the company. And, a delay on the eventual ramp of that new product, which will bring in significant revenues for the company. Likewise, I want to see how launch infrastructure is going. This is obviously a render, how it's planned to look. We're not quite there yet, but it's starting to really shape up. We have seen a lot of pictures from recent coverage on Electron launches, and they did say at a recent Electron launch that the major infrastructure items at the pad are done and dusted. So that's a pretty good sign from the launch infrastructure side of things, but I'd like to see some more information and pictures on that. Flight hardware, of course, is something I really want to see from Neutron as we close in on the guided launch date. We've seen a lot of hardware that could potentially be flight hardware. I'd like to see it come together, starting to get assembled into the larger structures. We have already seen, fairings, some of the panels that will form the structure, moldings, as well as tanks and things like that, but like to see it come together, of course, as well as more hot fires. In terms of things they still have to do, everything in yellow is from their website showing as in progress. We have stage 2 qualification. Now, we did see a few major tests on that front, including one to destruction where they blew up a tank, a second one where they didn't blow up a tank, but it looked like there had been some changes to that stage 2 tank as well. Flight mechanism tests in progress and engine qualification still in progress as they go through all those hot fire tests and various scenarios and tweaking going on there. Stage 1 qualification, we haven't seen a ton about stage 1, and that's something I'd really like to see more of soon. Launch complex 3, we talked about the launch complex needs to be complete, and regulatory approvals as well. Wouldn't mind hearing some more talk about that, although I do think we're looking all right in terms of test launch for Neutron for regulations. It's more about the going forward operations. And then these have not been colored in at all yet, meaning there's still to do, and that's a lot to do in a few months. I think we have about 3 months or so, 4 months until June. Yeah, 4 months here. Sorry about that. So a lot of stuff to do. They need to do that stage 2 hot fire. We have seen them working on the infrastructure and the test stand at Wallops for the stage 2, as well as stage 1 static fire and the vehicle integration, bringing it all together, as well as wet dress rehearsal and finally launch. So a lot of items they need to do. Once we see a full rocket, we're still going to have to see a lot of things like wet dress rehearsals and all that. So still would like to see things starting to come together in terms of the structure here, just to get a good idea on timeline. That's really my focus this earnings call more than anything else. Neutron timeline, just so important for the stock, for the overall company and their progress. But that's not to say the rest of the company is unimportant, because of course it is very important, and revenue growth has been quite impressive this year. So let's go over what we're thinking and expecting for Q4 in terms of revenues and all that kind of stuff. They did guide at the end of Q3 for $125 to $135 million in revenue. In terms of non-GAAP gross margin, that is 32 to 34%. Non-GAAP operating expenses are expected to be 75 to 77%, quite high, of course, as they are working on Neutron. Adjusted EBITDA loss, as they're still, once again, spending heavily on Neutron, 27 to 29%. Another factor, of course, with Neutron is the spending is expected to drop quite significantly once they're done with that first test launch and they move kind of from heavy R&D more into operations. So we are really looking forward to that drop in R&D when Neutron gets going. Another reason to watch for it so closely. In terms of what I'm thinking here, well, for launch, it's always pretty straightforward because we can always track how many launches they've had, which was 5 in the quarter. We had changes in latitudes, changes in attitudes, as well as Hasta La Vista, Ice Baby, Stonehenge, and Owl the Way Up, which means we had 2 haste launches and 3 regular launches. Usually haste is a bit higher revenue, although the margins are pretty similar, I think. So 10 million each for 2 haste launches plus 3 regular launches. I'd put in about 7.2 million on average for each, although the selling price on those regular launches has been rising lately as well. So that gives you a record of $72 million for launch. This has been a record quarter for number of launches, so I expect it likewise to be a record quarter for revenue for launch. And we have a little chart here from Wikipedia showing the launches. Light green is those haste suborbital, and green is the regular launches. And obviously we had no failures for the year, which is very good. Now for margins in launch, margins get better the more launches you have in a quarter. That's because they amortize or basically pay back the costs of that, flat infrastructure costs. There's a lot of flat costs for your pad and your people and all that, whether you launch once or 5 times. So if you can spread more launches across those same costs, then obviously your margins will be better. And since this was a record quarter for launches, I'd expect gross margins to be pretty much the strongest we've seen yet for Electron launch, which is obviously nice as well. And we hope that will continue to ramp into 2025. Always feels a little bit weird talking about Q4's numbers when we're so far into 2025 already, but that's what happens when you have some of these later earnings calls. The bright side of that, of course, is that Rocket Lab really knows what's going on with the coming quarter, and usually you can count on their guidance to be pretty accurate. So for example, they will be also guiding for Q1's numbers. Meanwhile, we're like over halfway through Q1 here, so we can expect pretty accurate numbers, and they should have good visibility for the remainder of Q1. Space systems, always a little more tricky because rockets, you can just literally count the launches. Space systems, a little bit more of a black box. Some factors here. So they issued Q4 guidance on November 12th, which I said is halfway through the quarter. So they should have had very good visibility on that revenue number. We do have a quote from those Q3 earnings calls saying that they expect continued growth in space systems revenue. Of course, that's rather vague, but we do know the Q3 number looks like it was about 83, maybe 85 million. I'm sure I can check the exact number. Anecdotally, we did see some large pallets of reaction wheels posted on Twitter headed out to the customer, which I'd imagine is Amazon. Those are worth a good amount of money, so we have to assume they realized a decent amount of revenue on those reaction wheels as well. They delivered the second Pioneer spacecraft for Varda in the quarter. That I would imagine would give some pretty good revenues as well. And then, of course, just kind of our gradual growth in space systems that we're seeing. We do know the components business is growing at a clip of about 20% CAGR. So personally, I'm thinking of leaning towards kind of the high end of the numbers here, thinking maybe they hit $90 million in space systems revenue, which is in red because that's an estimate. It would be continuing the growth trajectory of that space systems business pretty nicely here, seeing that ramp continue. And to me, it's just kind of on trend. It's kind of in with the higher end of their guidance, but still within the guidance. And it's a number that I've kind of landed on personally, but I would love to hear your guesses as well. Do share those in the comments down below. So if we take those numbers, the guidance from the company was $125 to $135 million. My estimate is about $132 million. So on the high end, but within the range there. Hopefully they do beat that. I try to be pretty conservative with these things, but that's my estimate. So if you do take those numbers, you're looking at about $132 million in Q4. This would be a nice record on a quarterly basis for the company. Previous record of $106 million already felt great because they had just recently broken that 6-digit mark in terms of revenues. So going from 104 to 132, obviously pretty solid growth numbers. Zooming out even further, if you look down at the bottom here, we can calculate what kind of a compound annual growth rate that would signify for the company over the past, 4-ish years. 2022, obviously amazing, was fueled by a bunch of those acquisitions. They grew 240%. 2023, pretty flat, a little bit disappointing, was only 16%. But 2024, these numbers would mean about a 79% growth versus the previous year, which is amazing, bringing the average compound annual growth rate over these 3 years to about 112%, basically doubling every year and then some. Can't complain with that. So great growth rate if they're even in the ballpark of their revenue estimates here. Again, do let me know what number you were kind of expecting for 2024's overall revenue number if you chart it out yourself. Now, on to contracts and backlog, obviously a very important factor. Going into Q4, we know that they had about $1.048 billion in backlog. I round that up to 1.05. $721 million of that was in space systems and about $326 million in launch. We also are estimating that they will realize about 132, sorry, that should have been a 2 here. Ignore that. $132 million in revenue in this quarter. And we do already know that they signed during the quarter their first Neutron contract for about 2 launches. They've been saying they want to get about $50 million per launch. It's possible they discounted this because it's a first customer. Maybe they're taking on additional risk being, the first real payload on a rocket. Maybe it's less, but if it is about $100 million for that contract, then we can expect that to get added to the backlog in the numbers we get. Now, there was a big partnership and deal announced with Kratos. I don't know if this would actually flow to the bottom line or if it's almost more like an IDIQ thing where they would get new task orders under this big deal. But in any event, that happened during Q1, so we shouldn't expect to see that in the backlog for the numbers in Q4. Sometimes they do give us extra slides saying like since Q4 and give us some info. So it'd be nice if we got that, but not expecting it. That would just be a bonus. What I'm looking for is some other new contracts, hoping to see some space systems deals. As I said, we're getting closer to the end of that Varda deal, delivered that second satellite. The third one's pretty much done from what I understand. They did deliver the 2 Mars spacecraft this year as well. I would really like to see some new deals on space systems to, keep that backlog growing. Right now, there was a pretty light news quarter in terms of contract announcements, so I'm thinking the backlog will be flat or maybe slightly up. But it's hard to say. Sometimes they like to hold back announcements on contracts to, the quarterly results and say it then. So, it's possible the backlog goes up and they announce some contracts retroactively, or, maybe the backlog is even down a little bit. It's hard to say for sure. Let me know what you think on the backlog. Obviously, we'd like to see it grow. And really, the next catalyst for backlog growth, other than some Neutron contracts, would be their next big space systems contract. That SDA deal currently comprising over half of the entire backlog. The Global Star deal, likewise, quite big, and a very big chunk of the backlog, too. So space systems contracts, very important as we look at that backlog growth. By the way, just a quick sellout second here as I tell you about finchat.io. This app brings all the power of AI to your stock research. I use it as well regularly. Type in whatever you want to know about a company. It scours the web, pulls it up, creates charts for you, provides guidance numbers for you, earnings call information, whatever you need from that single chat box. I find it incredibly useful. The link will be down in the comments as well. If you're interested, it obviously helps out the channel if you sign up with my affiliate link. Okay, let's get back to the video. In terms of what I'm thinking they might guide for, well, we do have some speaking notes from Adam Spice at a recent conference. He said, this year we've got a manifest that supports well over 20 launches. I'm kind of highlighting well there, so I take it more like 26 than 21 launches. Now, that's just what the manifest supports. What have we seen? Rarely does what the manifest support come to fruition because customers have issues, they get delayed, whatever. Not complaining, that's just how the business goes. So unless they kind of change how they do things, what I'm thinking here is that they'll guide for something like 26 launches. There'll be some customer issues throughout the year. Maybe we get 21 or 22 launches, which would still be decent growth over the 16 launch number that we got in 2024, and starting to get into kind of the target number for Electron, where their margins get better as they really hit scale and cadence. 24 is kind of what I've been looking for Electron, which is basically a launch every other week in order to get good margin numbers. But they've said, once they get to 22-ish launches, you can expect gross margins for Electron to push into the 40s, which is definitely a lot better than, when they're only launching, say, 6 times a few years back. We also know from comments that the components business, although it doesn't really get talked about much, has a compound annual growth rate about 20%, so that's pretty steady. And then the satellite business, again, very dependent on those lumpy, massive contracts. Okay, they also have this quote here from the Q3 call, very important. We expect approximately 50% of current backlog to be recognized as revenue within 12 months. The backlog at that time, $1.05 billion, 50% of that is $525 million. If you take out our Q4 estimate of 132, that leaves $393 million across the first 3 quarters of 2025. Average that number out, that means in the first 3 quarters, you're looking at about $131 million per quarter, which is pretty flat with what I'm expecting in Q4, $132 million there. Now, of course, they could sign contracts and actually realize revenue on them during this period. So these numbers are subject to upward revision if that happens. As well, we don't have Q4 in here, so you have to estimate what Q4 would be, and usually there's, growth across the year, so I would expect that to go up as well. I'm sitting at about $557 million in my valuation model for 2025. And by the way, if they do hit the numbers I'm estimating for 2024, that's actually a slight beat over what I had in my spreadsheet as well, which bodes well for my valuation. We're going to get into that after those actual numbers are released. I'm going to dive back into my spreadsheet and kind of see how I think the growth trajectory is shaping up versus what I was thinking, earlier in the year. So how does that sound for you guys about $500 million in revenue in 2025? Now, that is slowing over the massive growth rate we saw in 2024, but these things are very lumpy. And if you talk about 80% growth from 2023 to 2024, to me, it's reasonable to have a bit of a slower growth rate from 2024 to 2025, especially because Neutron, you're not expecting it to deliver any revenue really in 2025. It's going to have that test launch, and then the following year, perhaps 3 real launches. And of course, so much revenue coming in per launch on Neutron means it's a big driver as well. Other questions I do have about the quarter is, are we going to hear from the new COO, high profile hire, Frank Klein? He was from Rivian, I believe, brought in as the company really scales up, over 2,200 employees now, and looking to really scale their manufacturing, take the company to the next level, and basically drop the hammer on growth. As Peter Beck said, I think that would mostly be for space systems, but perhaps also for launch. He has a lot of experience in the automotive sector, so hopefully that translates well to the factories and manufacturing for space. Maybe we hear from him for the first time on this earnings call. That would be pretty interesting, hearing what he brings to the table and his thoughts on the company and growth as well. Hey guys, Dave from The Next Day here, doing some editing, and there was one more item I figured I should talk about. That is the fact that Rocket Lab and Globalstar have their earnings calls at the exact same day, same time this year. So there's been some speculation going around that maybe there's some sort of announcement, whether that could be cooperation, some kind of big contract, or even an acquisition or merger, something like that. I did check, and last year Rocket Lab's earnings call was on the 27th, while Globalstar's was on the 28th. So that's just a one-day shift. I think, to me, the most likely scenario is that the earnings call date just shifted one day for one of these companies, doesn't end up meaning anything. The other reason to throw cold water on that, of course, is that Globalstar had that big announcement with MDA just recently, that MDA will be manufacturing all their new next-gen satellites with their new MDA satellite bus model. And it would be a little odd to announce a big partnership with Globalstar right after, you're going with a different company for building out the next-gen satellite buses. Stranger things have happened, of course. I can't completely rule it out. It's possible that there is some partnership being announced or something like that. They want to simultaneously announce it, but my money is on just a coincidence, and we don't get any massive news on that front. Let me know what you think, though, as always, down below. But yes, wrapping it all up, once again, the numbers are important and we will watch out for them. All eyes should remain on the progress we see from Neutron. We usually get some pictures. Hopefully those pictures are showing some very good progress, and get a sense of the temperature in the room from Peter and Adam on when they think they might launch, even if they're saying mid 2025 is still the target. How are they phrasing it? How does it come across to us? These are all things I think we should keep in mind, because once again, every quarter that Neutron hasn't launched is probably like $40 million they're burning in spending on that program. And the timeline really does make a huge difference for the revenue numbers of the company going forward. I'm really looking forward to getting more updates on this, and it is by far the highest priority item of the company. So that's kind of what I'm thinking for the Q4 earnings call. What are you expecting? Are my numbers pretty much in line with yours? Are you more bullish, less bullish? What are you looking for? Do you think Neutron's on track, not on track? Let's continue the conversation in the comments down below. Once again, as always, every new subscriber, so helpful. So if you haven't subscribed and you do find this interesting and useful, I hope you'll consider doing that. Really helps me to continue going with the channel. I will be live streaming Rocket Lab's earnings call. So if you want to mark your calendars February 27th after the market close and come hang out with me, listen to the earnings call together, discuss, take notes, I would love to have you as well. And I do hope you have a great day, a great rest of the week, and I will see you soon for the next video. Bye for now.